conversation on inequality, moderated by Ramona Naddaff, with Judith Butler and Angela Davis. It's my honor to present this panel.
To make sure that anyone with a wheelchair, there's a little bit more space, could please come in. We have a few more spaces. And
no, we understand that there were people in wheelchairs who were turned away because of the capacity regulations for this hall. And we want to violate those regulations?
We're going to violate those regulations. Yeah.
So please open the door. Please open the door so that people outside can hear me. If there's anyone out there in a wheelchair and that would like to come in, please do so.
And also, if some people are standing and need to be sitting, would you come forward, and people who are actually sitting and don't need to sit, would you mind ceding your place to them?
And there's always a number 3. Are there any certified interpreters here that would like to help us out right now?
Did someone say yes?
With sign language, please. That's certified. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else? Well, I'm sorry, but this is the best we can do right now. Well, she's going to do the best she can right now. Please accept this as what we can do, and things will change in the future. We will discuss it. Thank you. I hear you. We're going to do the best we can. Is there anyone else that could help us with interpretation with sign language? We will discuss this. Please just wait, and it will be discussed. So, hi. I hate microphones, so excuse my lack of grace. I don't need to introduce Angela Davis or Judith Butler, but I'll just say I can't believe I'm standing next to these two activists, intellectuals, scholars, and public forces. And they've been an inspiration to me for more years than I'm going to tell you about. So this is really going to be a conversation, but I just want to start it out with a few signifiers or chains of signifiers that I'm going to ask our panelists to talk about, putting them into relation with each other and talking about it not just on a local or national, but also internationally. So I just want to lead with a few issues that we might be able to approach the forces of inequality, equality, justice, and freedom through way of these. So, the undocumented, Marine Le Pen, Black Lives Matter, prison reform, Palestine, Proposition number 8, the anti-Muslim ban. And I offer you to bring in any others that you would like, but I just wanted to lead with those that I think are rich with resonance and relations. So thank you again, and thank Timothy and Kira for organizing.
Well, why don't we, why don't we add disability to that list?
We will.
And let's start by actually talking about it as a matter of equality and inequality, because when we talk about spaces being accessible, or when we talk about pavements being built in such a way that people in chairs have mobility, we're actually talking about rights of access, especially to public events, sometimes to public institutions, sometimes to modes of participation that are central to citizenship as we know it. And here I use citizenship to include those who got papers and those who don't. And we're also talking about rights of mobility, which are actually crucial for thinking about what democracy is, because if people cannot move, they cannot assemble, they cannot come together, they cannot deliberate, they cannot decide, they cannot reflect together, they are not part of the public world. So it goes to the heart of what we talk about when we talk about equality. And it also puts the body in the center of that issue. Equality is not just an abstract right that individuals have and bear and express in their own way. Equality is a question of equal treatment and equal opportunity, but also having lives that are regarded as being equal in worth to all other lives, and being able to exercise bodily freedoms. And that includes, I mean, for people who are in chairs or who have other kinds of disabilities, access and movement, but it also, let's think about it, there are a lot of people who can't move on the street. I mean, who has the freedom to move on the street? Who has the freedom to move in safety on the street without being shot, without being harassed, without finding an impediment with a curb stop, right? These issues are linked. And I just want to underscore that the ability to move and to have the technology and the infrastructure that lets people move and assemble and participate and enter into spaces and traverse the public sphere is part of our freedom, and it is also a place where we find radical inequality.
Hi, Judith.
Hi.
Judith likes to jump right in.
Sorry. Sorry.
And I totally appreciate the way in which you so eloquently allowed us to think about the degree to which issues of ability and disability are interwoven into all issues of inequality and injustice. Let me say that there are some serious problems here, and I think it's always important when we come together as a community, however brief that might be, to reflect on where we are and who we're sharing space with, who we should be sharing space with. And so first of all, I think it's so important to recognize that we're on Ohlone land, and that this is colonized land. And that if we have a deep sense of the space, we recognize the history of this space. And the fact that this is not accessible. And yes, there are many places, many spaces that are inaccessible. But we should say that an event that is designed to celebrate intellectual community, political community, an event that is designed to allow us to engage in discussions about racism, misogyny, globalization, that event should be accessible. And it's not. And I'm just going to reveal a little bit of the pre-event conversations. We were asked to cancel the event because it's not accessible and because we don't have certified ASL interpreters. And I can tell you that I'm sitting here very ambivalently now. primarily because I think that these issues should be discussed in a broad context, and that all of you should be willing to take these issues to your community. I mean, we need, of course, a vast movement that is going to transform this entire society with respect to accessibility. And this is just the beginning. So yeah, so I had to say that before I responded to the questions we've been asked to think about. Inequality, on the one hand, it can be very abstract. What do we mean by inequality? Who sets the standards for equality? And I'm concerned about the fact that we often work with the assumption that equality already exists, right? And that we have to be included, that some of us who have been left out of that space of equality have to be assimilated into equality. And I don't think I would have been compelled to work with. Historically, and I know that democracy is a good thing, or should be a good thing, or hopefully one day will be a good thing. But I'm concerned about the fact that the ways in which we tend to think about democracy are so totally racialized. And we don't, and I always like to point out that we never talk about Haiti. We never talk about the Haitian Revolution when it comes to the great advances that have been made with respect to equality and justice and democracy. And if we did, we would have to talk about racism, and we would have to talk about misogyny.
Great, welcome.
Thank you.
Sort of. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I appreciate this entrance and this event.
I want to let you know that we have deaf and disabled people of color outside who cannot come in. They don't have access to this event. We wanted to let you know that. They're being blocked from coming.
I thought she was here to help us interpret.
No,
She's there.
Okay. No, I thought you came and I understood.
people do not have access to this event.
So there are deaf people outside who have been barred from coming?
I thought she was going to bring someone in.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I am deaf. I know a lot of people involved in the Bay Area writing scene. I've been involved in this my whole life.
This is going to have to play out in one way or another.
There are a lot of people who are here, so I wanted to let you know. We'd love to see you all here, and we wanted to see you, but we can't. I wanted to let you know that. I'm going to be outside to tell people. Thank you.
Is there anybody, can you ask if there's anyone out there that can
Well, perhaps we should have a discussion about this, and we should invite people
I think
who
we need
are
to
deaf
invite people in.
into this.
Yes, Peter, yes, but people choose it, and shame on the city council.
Right.
Yeah.
But also, we could be gathering in another space as well.
Okay. So, Angela and Judith?
I guess I would like to know whether, in fact, there are people out there who have not been able to gain access. And if that's it, please go.
And could you please see if there's any sign language interpreters that could come in and help us? That I believe either certified or non-certified at this point.
Well, she just left, though. The person who was assistant just walked out of the district.
Is everyone seated that needs to be seated?
We invited everyone in the building who is disabled to enter this room. That's what we've done.
Right. Okay. All right.
But then there's also the question of deaf people not being able to, there's also the question of the lack of an ASL, certified ASL interpreter, so that...
Brought to our attention on Tuesday, we scrambled as hard as we could to find 2 interpreters very quickly. We contacted the 2 of them. One of them didn't show up today. Okay? Didn't show up. Is that my fault? I guess it is.
Yeah, but let's not be defensive. Let's find an affirmative way forward.
Right. Okay. So. Okay.
That's true.
Yeah.
I think Kira tried to own it, and I think, as Angela said, we need to make this moment now something that will change. What we can do right now is limited, but I think we need to organize so it's different in the future and make this something about a potential change. And I really hope we can turn the conversation to reorienting our actions towards a different type of future as far as possible. That's what we can do right now. And hopefully someone else will come in to help us at least solve one problem.
Well, we're all gathered here, and we're working under conditions that are certainly very difficult. But I think it's important to learn how to work through and with, all of the restraints. To continue to have a discussion should not mean that we're putting aside the issue of the inaccessibility of this space. And I think that, feminism, the kind of feminism that I've learned from Judith Butler, and the kind of feminism that one sees activists who are struggling against racism and challenging the assaults on the undocumented, the kind of feminism that they embrace is a capacious feminism that allows us to work at the heart of contradictions without necessarily being compelled to choose one side or the other. So I want to appeal to you to experience this sense of deep trouble that has been brought about as a result of the problems of accessibility of this space, and attempt at the same time to have a conversation that will hopefully move us forward. I don't know what you all think about that.
Okay.
And Judith,
Okay.
what do you think?
Well, I jumped in quickly before, but let me say how honored I am to be here with Angela, as we all are. And Angela is someone from whom I have been learning now for a very long time. And she always shocks me into a new way of thought. It's never an easy transition. Oh, I think I'll think about that. No. It's like shocks me into a new way of thought. And I think that, I was thinking about coming here, and I had kind of three thoughts. One was, as somebody who has worked in lesbian, gay, queer, and trans activism for many years, I, like many other people, had mixed feelings about the Equality Act and the equality movement within the lesbian and gay community. And I'm going to call it lesbian and gay because I think that is exactly what that movement was. That was pushing for that, for marriage rights. And I was thinking what happened to the notion of equality when equality became identified with gay marriage rights. And of course, many of those people wanted to own property together or bequeath property or to become upstanding middle-class citizens of a certain kind and to have the same kind of recognition for their relationships, their intimate, usually dyadic relationships that straight people had. And I watched as kind of radical traditions of innovating and experimenting with various forms of intimate alliances were backgrounded. I watched as property ownership became at the center of the idea of freedom and equality. I watched as well as state recognition became the object of desire. And I thought, well, which state, and do we want that recognition, and what's the cost of recognition? Nobody was asking. Well, many people were asking, but it wasn't in the mainstream. But it was also, I think, a predominantly white movement as well. And even though they were talking equality, as they talked, there was another tradition of the struggle for racial equality that struck me as effaced or as backgrounded, as that became the new equality discourse. So when Angela says, what do we mean when we talk about equality, it seems to me we have to ask who's using it for what purpose, and how does the use maybe mobilize a history or efface a history? What are the alliances that are made through one usage or another usage? And of course, I think if there's going to be marriage, anybody should be able to marry. I have no idea why you can only marry one other person, but okay. I mean, I'm not like against it, and if there's going to be that right, then it should be extended to gay and lesbian people. There's no question about it. But the radical critique of marriage, or even the implication of marriage in property relations, it's almost like we evacuate any analysis of political economy. We evacuate the analysis of the state, and we also evacuate other traditions of the struggle for equality. What does it mean that Black Lives Matter is happening, or was, it still is happening to the side of that equality issue? Like, are they speaking to each other? I think, in fact, not. I don't know if I want to go further with that, but
yeah, and I'm thinking that there's always been this push for assimilation. Why do we have to assume that existing modes, existing standards are the ones to which we have to assent. I mean, yeah, I very ambivalently supported the Marriage Equality Act, and the same. But it seems as if, as you pointed out, there ought to be a way to include a critique at the same time. And the problem is not that people. Oh, it's not loud enough? Okay. Okay, well, I can actually hold it like this if that's better. Move this out of the way. And so, yeah, it's not the so much that people assume that existing heteronormative standards of marriage were the only ones. It was the reluctance to engage in a serious critique. You know, why is it not possible, say, to get married, and at the same time recognize what a excuse me, I'm in the council table. You know,
Or in council chambers.
you know, what kind of an institution it is. You know, based on property, based on property ownership, property inheritance. I think property is the major problem here.
Yeah.
This is why it is not possible, I think, to engage in any serious conversation about inequality or equality without addressing capitalism.
Yes.
Without addressing capitalism. And of course, there are those who want to address capitalism, but who don't want to talk about racism,
Yeah.
or who don't want to talk about misogyny, or who don't want to talk about homophobia, or any of the other issues. And unfortunately, you know, over the last period, both activists and scholars have learned that it is important, that it is possible, not only possible, but important to address these issues together. You know, the term that people use is intersectionality. I don't know whether that's the best way to address it, but it's not necessary to leave racism in order to have a serious conversation about democracy. You know, one of the problems now is that Democrats, I think, are, when I say Democrats, I mean members of a certain political party, right, are assuming that the reason the election was lost had to do with what they called identity politics.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
you
That was
know.
definitely the reason. Yeah.
Yeah. And so now they're saying, let's forget about identity politics, which means let's forget about all of the issues that really matter when it comes to democracy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And let's just, well, we need to talk about the working class more. And of course we need to talk about the working class. We've always needed to talk about the working class. But the assumption is that the working class is white. And the assumption is still that the working class is male. And I don't understand how people walk around with these
They do, though.
you know, I mean, I guess that's why ideology really is one's imagined relationship to reality.
Well, but let's take that seriously, because one of the things you're suggesting is that we don't yet know what equality might mean, right? So you're asking us not to accept established ideas of equality, or not. You're asking us not to simply adapt or conform or to ask for assimilation to an existing framework of equality, because equality has not yet been thought in the radical ways that it needs to be thought, which means we have to imagine it, which means we need experimentations, as it were, of thought that allow us to think equality maybe for the first time, or to think it anew. And so often when we stay with existing frameworks, we find out that whole populations are left out, or whole dimensions of human existence are left out. And I was thinking, for instance, that the Black Lives Matter movement, which now is at risk, it's being criminalized in some places, and it's at risk of being more massively criminalized depending on the momentum that some of these really pernicious legal efforts are taking. It was, I think, and is still adamantly asserting equality, but it's the equality of the value of life. And we might think in an abstract way we know what that is. Oh yeah, all lives are equal. Sure, all lives are equal, you know, that's in the Declaration, it's in the Constitution, yes, yes, yes. But this country has...
They say all men are
all
equal.
Men, all men.
I have to remind you that.
Okay, all men. But as we know that those forms of universalizing equality, saying all men, they always carry with them that grave exception, like gender, race, right? Native peoples, who's being effaced, or whose effacement is being further effaced through that assertion. And then the question is, but what would it mean for it to be, in fact, capacious, inclusive, where nobody is sacrificed, right? When we talk about intersectionality, I think we're trying to imagine a kind of analysis and a kind of movement that is all-inclusive, in which nobody gets sacrificed. We don't sacrifice race for a political economy. We don't sacrifice sexuality for gender, right? We just don't do it.
But it also means that the whole framework will have to be transformed. And I think the problem is, up until now, we've assumed that inclusiveness, diversity, all of these watchwords refer to an existing framework that continues to be the same.
Yeah.
And so what we want to do is make a racist society inclusive by including Latinx people or black people, but it's still a racist society.
Yeah.
Or make the misogynist society inclusive,
Yeah.
by including, so forth and so on.
Yeah.
So this is the dilemma that we confront when we think about punishment. And this is why I think prison abolition is central, not only with respect to the issue of reimagining a punishment system, but reimagining society. So it's so interesting that if one looks at the long history of the institution of the prison in the U.S. and the world, the U.S., which is really responsible for offering imprisonment as punishment to the rest of the world. This, incidentally, was a very important element of the democracy, because prisons are perhaps the quintessential democratic institution. And we could talk about that if you want. But, and so why is it that for centuries, decades and centuries, there have been these efforts to create a better prison? I mean, and it's been happening over and over and over again. And the better punishment framework, the better imprisonment techniques, the better strategies have only led to more repressive, more racist, more sort of all-embracing carceral approaches. And we're still there right now, even at this moment, when perhaps more than at any other time since perhaps the beginning of the 70s with the Attica Rebellion, there is a consciousness of the need to do something about the fact that 25% of the world's imprisoned population resides in the U.S., and that 1/3 of all incarcerated women live in prisons in the United States of America. 1/3 of all incarcerated women on the entire planet. But it seems that the mainstream question is still, well, okay, how can we make it better? You know, how can we release some? How can we move from mass incarceration to, you know, I don't know what the opposite would be, selective incarceration. I don't know. You know, but that has been the question, and abolition urges us to think radically, to think outside of that framework, to think about something entirely different, something entirely new.
I mean, one part of your analysis that has been so important to many of us, Angela, is that the prison system continues, in some sense, the legacy of slavery in this country when we consider the numbers of black and brown people who are incarcerated, and that means deprived of their voting rights, deprived of the ability to function in public as citizens, to participate in any way. So there's it's almost as if the enfranchisement of the slaves is being reversed through imprisonment. That imprisonment is the method through which voting rights are destroyed for many black and brown people. And I think we have to think about that it is part of a systemic and institutional inequality. I'm wondering if we could also relate that to your earlier remarks about keeping capitalism in mind. How do you put it together? I know you do.
Okay, well, since you're inviting me.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you know, capitalism, I like, you know, Cedric Robinson's notion of racial capitalism. Capitalism has always been racial capitalism. Capitalism would not be the economic institution, global economic institution it is today, had it not been for slavery, had it not been for colonization. And somehow we think that these are separate issues, but they are not. I'm thinking parenthetically about the difficulty that someone like Bernie Sanders had incorporating an analysis of race into his critique of capitalism, and that's exactly what we need, what we would have needed.
Yeah.
It would have worked much better.
No, I think it was a secondary oppression. Once again, race is a secondary.
That you added on, you know, and I'm thinking about Elizabeth Spellman, whom I read many years ago. We talked about the ampersand problem. You remember?
Yes, I do.
You know, of course you do. That you can't just add something on. You can't just add it and assume that the problem is solved. You can't just add, you know, black people into the system and end up with people like Dick Parsons. I mean, he's not one of the wealthiest men in the world, but he was the CEO of, what was it, Time Warner and AOL. And you can't just assume that by adding the previously excluded into the existing set of arrangements that there's going to be any significant change. It continues the way it has always continued. And this is why I like the notion that, you know, diversity means difference that really doesn't make a difference. You know, that you can, that there can be difference, but it makes no significant difference. And this is why we have to think about the extent to which slavery is very much present. This is still the afterlife of slavery. And many efforts to address the ways in which racism had become so central to the social, political, economic structures and the psyche, the collective psyche of the country, that has never been addressed. And therefore, we're still living that afterlife. And of course, the fact that there are, as Elizabeth Alexander pointed out, there are more black men in prison and under the control of the criminal justice system today in the 21st century than there were enslaved in 1850 is one indication. But yeah, we're still living with slavery, and it's not just the prison system. It's also capital punishment, capital punishment would not be a normal mode of punishment in the United States of America were it not for slavery, were it not for the fact that this institution survived through slavery at a time when even the men who were calling for democracy were saying that we need to abolish capital punishment. Benjamin Franklin and all those guys, those white guys back then. And we still have it. And that is a sign that we have not effectively addressed the vestiges of slavery. And this is a problem not just for black people. Somehow the assumption is that it's black and brown people, Asian people, Native people who have to deal with racism. And I'm tired of that. Yeah, Black Lives Matter. Yeah. But the point, of course, is that if ever Black lives were really to matter, that would mean that all lives matter.
That's right.
That would be the indication.
We're not there yet.
That all lives matter. Yeah. It's a different approach to the universal.
Yeah, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. But I think that when we see or witness or experience in our personal lives, mainly black and brown people, unarmed, who are shot down, whether it's in Fruitvale or in Oakland or in North Carolina or in Brooklyn, or strangled. In a way, we get the graphic moment of that violence from slavery that has not vanished from the history of this country. And of course, then the institutional means like death penalty and imprisonment, which continue that legacy in another way. And occasionally, we get the very graphic example of a black man being hunted down like a dog, right? I mean, really, what is the difference between that and slavery or strangulation and slavery? So we do have that, but I wonder whether we could, as we think about the future and we take up your challenge to imagine equality in a new way and to insist that it take a new form, one that's not been historically available to us. What would it mean to think about a form of socialism that had anti-racism at its center, that didn't sacrifice feminism, that was not transphobic, that was taking into account the deeply legitimate demands of the disability movement, where we actually had that kind of amazing collection of groups that understood each other and had a profound analysis of how capitalism works. Do you think you could show us the way, Angela?
But Judith, can I ask, don't you think sometimes with your work you do that with vulnerability and
just
precarity?
Joking.
I know she's joking you, but I know you're asking, but I'd like to ask you
About
vulnerability and precarity as one of the main ways in which you are having us.
Well, I guess what I'm worried about is that a lot of my friends on the left who are still working in some older models of Marxism think we're dealing with wage laborers and their exploitation, and indeed we are. One reason we continue to need unions and have to really fight against the massive union busting. But a lot of people are no longer wage laborers. They work here and there. They have precarious work lives. They don't have they don't have the possibility of being part of a union. They don't have those protections. They don't have property, and they don't have health insurance. And that condition of precarity is extreme. So I think we have to listen carefully to those who are trying to explain to us these new versions of precarity. I mean, 12% of the world's population now lives in a global slum. I mean, what does that mean? And how many people have any kind of job security anymore? It's become less and less the case.
But do you think that unions can transform?
Well,
or that we can develop a new paradigm
I think
for
we need to
unions?
defend unions, and I think we need to work with unions. But I also believe that precarious work is a huge problem, and a lot of times those people who are part-time, who are only getting jobs seasonally, or they're not part of union structures because they're not there on a regular basis.
But what if we think about very different union structures? I think this is the challenge, really. Unions tend to think about wage labor, as you pointed out, in these very rigid, traditional ways. But considering the fact that with all of the changes that have happened as a result of globalization, that women who do manufacturing work, women who do care work, really constitute the new worker. And unions are not thinking about how to organize the unorganized.
Yeah.
Unions has always been, right? But why is it that unions are not thinking about organizing prisoners? There have been efforts within the prison system in the U.S. for decades to create unions in prisons, so that workers who work in prisons, as a matter of fact, I don't want to talk about better prisons, but sometimes I do end up doing that.
We forgive you.
I was impressed when I did some research in Cuban prisons that Cuban prisoners were members of the same unions and received the same pay scale and the same benefits as people did in the so-called free world.
Yeah,
and that made a major difference. So again, I suppose the question is, why do we continue to assume that the old structures of organizing, the old epistemic structures are going to be the ones that lead us to a new world?
Well, it may be that the precariat is overtaking the proletariat in some way, or that we need to think them together. But the truth is that there are a lot of very interesting movements of people who are squatting, or people who are, in Barcelona, the amazing organization against banks that were foreclosing on people who had been living in homes or renting places for a very, very long time, and that did become a very important movement, and they put the head of that movement, Ada Colau, into power, into political power. And it seems to me that throughout Latin America and Europe and many other places, we're seeing new forms of organization that are trying to take into account new forms of economic destitution, right? And building alliances on the basis of it. And the real question is that going to happen in a way that also allows us, to think about the centrality of race, the centrality of class, or new ways in which class is being articulated under this economy, under this global economy, and what are the possibilities for transnational alliance? That's what I'm kind of trying to suss out, like what's possible here.
I hate to interrupt you, but I'm gonna invite the audience in the few minutes we have remaining to continue this conversation. If a mic will be passed around, and why don't we start right here? Thank you.
Hello. I just want to start by saying thank you for being here. as real life, like heroes and existing with us in the struggle. I know you have scars, and yet you're still here. And as a
Which is what the charge for union
time professor, emphasis on part-time. You know, I'm in the struggle. I fight racism and sexism on a daily basis. However, in battling, it's better with groups. And yet, in these groups that I'm in, it hurts the worst when it's other people of color or other women who are like fighting each other like we're crabs in a bucket. And so when I'm at that moment and my soul hurts, I'm wondering, like, how do you heal when it's your own people?
So do you want both of us to address that?
No, I think that you do.
I'm sure you have different techniques of healing, right?
Yeah, that's a really challenging problem. But I think that it also leads to the question of how we build community and who constitutes our community, who helps to create our community. And, you know, I raised the specter of identity politics before, and I think that term has been so used and misused because it is Black people, Native people, Latinx people, women, the LGBTQ movement, the disabled movement. These are the communities that have made the most progress when it comes to democracy in this country. And there's an effort to marginalize these communities by referring to them, oh, they're just identity. These are special interests, just identity politics. So I think that we have to acknowledge that. And then, of course, we have to find ways of surviving. I was actually telling Judith the other day that someone asked me in one of my lectures recently why I hadn't been assassinated. He said, and they named all the people who had been assassinated and said, well, why are you still here?
Oh, God.
So I said, I don't know. I really don't know. But I do know that as long as I am here, it's my responsibility to continue to do the work and to bear witness for those who haven't been able to make it this far. And that, of course, also involves doing what we often call self-care, which I think should be collective self-care. Because oftentimes we assume that self-care is an individualistic process, that we have to go off and heal ourselves before we can rejoin the community of struggle. And so some people are doing really interesting thinking about how we create collective modes of healing and self-healing, and how we come to, how can we allow people to bring their whole selves into the space of struggle. Because there is so much trauma. Collectively, we represent, you know, as you were saying, so much pain and so much trauma, and the assumption often is that, oh, we find the therapist, we do whatever we need to do individually, but we've never figured out how to address that collectively. And I think that's one of the major challenges of this period. That's one of the major challenges that young activists are going to have to address. And I think you look like you're young. Although, you know, the older you get, everybody looks young, so.
Judith, do you want to?
I would just reiterate there's a lot of pain and fear, and it's escalating. We're seeing, a lot of undocumented people living in massive fear, a lot of discretionary power being intensified on the part of police and immigration officials. We have a government that's clearly out of control. We don't know what's going to happen, and a lot of accelerating economic inequality, and people are feeling the deep fear of losing what they need in order to be okay financially, and people who thought they were going to be okay are no longer okay and are living with new forms of anxiety, and people who were never okay are being ground down by a kind of anxiety they've been living with their whole lives. So, and that sometimes we get spiky then, right? We lash out, we're angry, we're trying to find power somewhere, but it's because we're not building something together. I mean, the minute we start coalescing and building something together, that's when you're part of something else. And it's a problem, because the so-called left, I presume we are the left, whoever the left is, we're not yet building. We're still disoriented, right? But we're not yet building the way we need to be building. And I'm reminded of Angela's idea of restorative justice, which is her alternative to the prison system. And that idea presumes that communities have the power to heal one another and to heal themselves, and that they are empowered with that. And there's a beauty to that notion that I think we need to think more about and come together to really think about how that happens practically, person to person.
I think we have someone even younger to speak to us.
Hi, my name is Aaliyah Moore, and I'd like to ask a question. How can we close prisons?
Close prisons. Oh, wow. This is somebody who.
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question. Okay. You really want the answer?
Yeah.
I don't have the answer, but this is what I'm a part of an ever larger group of people who really want to make sure that prisons do not represent our future. So first of all, we have to make sure that no new prisons are built. And people all over the country are addressing these issues. They're even, sometimes there's the argument, but we really need a place for young people. So we need the youth detention facilities, the juvenile justice. No new prisons. And then there are efforts to shut down existing spaces. For example, Rikers Island is one of the, we were talking about issues of ability and disability. Rikers Island constitutes one of the 3 largest mental institutions in the country, along with Chicago and LA, Cooks County and LA County. And so if the pressure continues, Rikers Island will be shut down. It will no longer exist. But we have to, at the same time, call for, the word incarceration? Have you ever heard that word? Mm-hmm. Well, incarceration basically means putting people in prison, right? Okay. So there's another word, and that's decarceration. That means, what does that mean? Taking people out of prison, absolutely. So, that is, and there are a number of other strategies I could talk about. But what's most important, and this is why prison abolition represents a lot more than just getting rid of prisons. What's more important is to try to create a society that doesn't need prisons. So then tell me, what do you think we need? What do you think we need? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Schools, absolutely. Schools, not prisons. You see? You know, and then we could talk about housing and health care and all of these things. That is precisely what it means to try to get rid of prisons. Thank you so much for the question and the answer.
Beautiful.
And then there's kind of a fair we can go to after.
But there's a root problem. Children are being taught there's a root problem. Children are being taught these biases from the start, and that's what causes discrimination. How are we supposed to stop this if we can't get to the parents and stop homophobia and transphobia and things like this? It's not their fault. They're being taught this way.
Well, I'll say a few words, and then I know that Judith has something to say on this issue as well, especially. You know, we often become so frustrated by the immensity of the problems that we're facing. And, you know, racism is one of those huge, huge problems. How can we possibly believe that one day racism will have been purged from our worlds? Homophobia, you know, how can we possibly believe that one day there will be a period in our history, we may no longer be around, and I think that's the key. We assume that in order for there to be any legitimate approaches to these great issues, that they're going to have to provide some solutions like right now, you know. You understand what I'm saying? We want, and in a sense, capitalism has encouraged us to think in temporalities that require us to want the answer right now. If you don't have the answer now, and especially if you don't have the answer in my lifetime, what does it matter? Because my life is the measure of everything. So how, and I know there are many other ways to approach your question, but I'm thinking about you know, how we encourage a very different temporality when it comes to the justice work, the work for equality that we're doing. You know, how do we learn how to do this work and passionately and urgently, and yes, try to get a hold of the parents and but the parents, a lot of the parents are not going to change, you know. So how do we think about, well, what happens the next generation, and then the generation after that? And I like the fact that most indigenous people think in temporalities that are so much vaster and so much more capacious than the capitalist temporalities we work with. We think that, you know, what is the 5-year outcome? Like if you're writing a grant for some community organization, the foundation is going to ask you, you know, what is the 2-year outcome? What is the 5-year outcome? Suppose we ask, well, what is the 100-year outcome? You know, what is the 200-year outcome? And I think that's how we have to begin to think, because we would not be gathered in this space today if it weren't for the work that people did hundreds of years ago. And so, you know, I've been thinking about the fact that we are the manifestation of the imagination of those who came before us and who didn't give up because it wasn't going to be possible to completely abolish colonization or completely get rid of slavery. They still struggled. And we are here as a testament to that persistence. And so we also have to imagine our responsibility to that long sense of history. And the fact that the work that we do now, even if it seems as if like it's not making a major difference, it will make a difference. And there will be people gathered somewhere 200 years from now who will be thankful to us for the work that we did during the short time we were together. And I think we have to begin to think in those terms.
So this is really horrible.
Okay. Just briefly, when I was your age, I thought I basically didn't know any other queer people, and the way it was talked about and the way my parents talked about it, it seemed like I was headed towards a psychiatric institution to get corrected. But luckily I found some other people who didn't think that way, right? So a little disobedience, a little bucking of what you've been taught, a little critical thought, a little community where you can think something new together. I was also taught that Israel was the saving place for the Jewish people and that it was a beacon of democracy in the Middle East, and they didn't tell me that the founding of Israel involved the massive death of so many Palestinians and the expulsion of more than 800,000, and that people still were living in the West Bank and Gaza with no substantial political rights, and that there are over 6 million Palestinian refugees with no way to exercise their legitimate right of return. I mean, I was taught a lot, but you can unteach yourself, and you can be taught differently, and you can think, and you can become part of communities that help you think well, and that support you and allow you to be brave and courageous in moving beyond what you have been taught.
Thank you. This time has ended, but there will be a longer future time.
I think we probably should end on with everyone making a commitment to address the issues we talked about at the very beginning. As a matter of fact, this is City Hall, right? And this is council chambers, right? So this is the center of Oakland. Well, the center of one part of Oakland. And so what are we going to do to guarantee that this space is accessible? So let's think about that. You know, take it back to your organizations, to your communities, and thank you so much for coming out.